the final climactic encounters, or set-piece encounters. Whether we're talking about tavern brawls, massive pirate conflicts, or clashes against massive monsters, there are a lot of reasons that you want to end or punch up your campaigns with some spectacular encounters. And today, we're going to be talking about making the most epic of encounters. Hello, I'm Kyle. Welcome to Desks and Dorks. A couple things. First off, thanks for watching. Really appreciate it. If you would like to continue to support us, the best way to do so is to like, share, comment, and subscribe. Specifically, liking and sharing. I mean that a lot, but like literally every single share boosts our video count. It's awesome. And if you really, really want to support us, the absolute best way to do so is to purchase all of our games. The links are below, and again, you can get them over on itch.io if you're a PDF person, or you can get them from any of our distributors. Now, with all of that being said, let's talk about all the cool stuff that we're doing today. So, when I think of a set-piece encounter, I think of a major encounter that plays out differently than the usual part of your adventure. So, for example, in a fantasy RPG, if you have been, traipsing through a fantasy city, you might be used to dungeon crawling or palace intrigue. What you might not be used to is a massive battle in the courtroom of the palace where your characters reside. That is what I consider a set-piece encounter. It's something that sort of breaks the norm of what you're used to, and it provides you not only with just a little bit of difference, but also with some extra punch, some extra panache, some extra excitement. They're not something that you want to throw at your players all the time, because then they lose that excitement, but when they are used and used effectively, they can be the best part of a campaign. So, a couple things. I wanted to do something special. I wanted to cover what I think are two very underused set-piece encounters that you can use in your own campaigns, and then I wanted to actually talk about how I am going to, make use of those and do those. But before we do that, I wanted to make sure that we have a couple ground rules established. One, no bar fights, no tavern stuff. That happens all the time. I think it's pretty cliche. I want to avoid that. No dragons or similar types of monsters. Again, people know how to throw those in, right? If you want to really spice up your campaign, chuck a dragon in. It's the coolest way to do it, but you all already know how to do that, right? If you're in a fantasy RPG or any RPG where there's magic and monsters involved, a big creature of some kind is usually going to spice things up. The last thing is I want to try to avoid cliches. We've all been to a tournament or seen the tournament arcs in fantasy or in like anime or in other stuff. Want to try to avoid basically things that are usually well done, with one exception, which we'll get to in like probably right about now. But again, these are my general ground rules. Let's talk about it. The one that I think is actually underused, despite the fact that it is kind of cliche, is the rickety rope bridge scene. Now, if you're like me, you may have grown up watching a certain satchel-carrying, fedora-wearing explorer actually do the single best rope bridge scene in the history of ever, right? The Indiana Jones Temple of Doom bridge scene is incredible, and if I wanted to spend another 4 hours trying to wrestle with copyright holders to let me use videos for fair use, I would wrestle with those clips. I did not want to do that, so we're just going to have this wonderful still image of Harrison Ford and his incredible jawline. There you go. However, despite the fact that it is cliche in that it's like one of the first things that people talk about, it is in fact one of the things that I don't see game masters using very often. And that's a shame, because I really do think that it lends for some really interesting stuff. Let's talk about how I think you could do it. Now, there is one thing I want to stress. A traditional rope bridge is very narrow. For the purposes of your game, depending on what type of system you use, I would highly encourage you to make it wide enough to fit 2 or 3 characters, because it's going to be really narrow in terms of its applications. If you can only fit one person in single file on the bridge, it makes it really difficult for stuff like magic or other abilities, depending on what type of system you are playing. Looking at you, D&D, you do a terrible job with it, which is why I think nobody uses the rickety bridge for that particular system. So, again, I didn't mention this in the slide, but I wanted to talk about it here. Please make sure that your rope bridge is at least 2 to 3 characters wide so that you can play around with it a little bit more. Trust me, if your players can suspend their disbelief in a fantasy role-playing game setting, they can believe that someone in that world has enough of an engineering degree to make a bridge that it can fit 2 to 3 people shoulder to shoulder. You could do the boring thing. And this is the thing that I think everyone always gets wrong, which is they're like, oh, have them make rolls to avoid falling, put crocodiles at the bottom, make it so that the bridge is going to collapse. No, 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 no. I think what you really need to do is play around with momentum. Now, when we want to talk about momentum and use momentum in a game setting, it's really important to make things apparent to your players. So for this example, we're just going to be using this humble D6 to represent the momentum or the shaking of this rickety bridge that they're on. Now, depending on how much of a jerk you want to be, you can set this momentum at something low like 1 or something high like 4 or maybe even 5. And the rule of thumb is if the momentum ever gets to 6, the bridge itself collapses and all of the characters on it are plunged into a watery grave. Why is this interesting? Well, every actions the players take and every action their enemies or non-player characters take on that bridge cause the momentum to shift. So for example, charging across the bridge to fight an enemy might raise you 1 or 2 momentum points, whereas spending a turn to use magical powers to steady the bridge might actually cause it to drop a momentum point. Where this gets interesting is now players are not necessarily always going to take the action that's the best for combat, but they are going to take the action that is best for the survivability of everybody stuck on that bridge, which, interestingly enough, can in fact include their enemies. What this means is not only is this very interesting from a combat perspective, because suddenly the best move for combat might not necessarily be the best move for survivability, but what's really interesting is that a diplomatically minded player, like this one, might be more willing to try to coax down their foes because they know that if the enemy charges and their ally charges, for example, everybody might be destroyed. This sort of push your luck style of combat is really interesting, and the reason I want you to be public with this D6, oh, and by the way, my wonderful bridge represented by the miniatures box that I had when I was like 10. But the reason I want you to have a D6 to do this is, 1, it telegraphs to the players exactly how much danger they're in, and 2, this will cause some actual real-world stress in your players, just like it would if they're watching this bridge wobble back and forth, which I think is really awesome. Extra points if you want to use something like a Jenga tower, for example, and make players actually pull blocks from the tower for every action they take. That's another cool way that you can do this. But I think using momentum like a D6 like this, something that's easily telegraphed and explainable, but that makes combat feel much more exciting, is far more interesting. And bonus points if you use some audio cues, like some wobbling sounds, to make it that much easier. But again, this humble D6 and a little bit of a multi-use bridge, I think, is a really good way to add some tension and an exciting encounter to your fantasy role-playing games. All right, and now that we've talked about momentum as a system, it's time to talk about sieges. Now, again, maybe it's a little cliche, right? We've all, at least if you're me and you had a Fisher-Price castle and you became obsessed with Helm's Deep at the age of 15, we've all seen the fantasy hero siege, right? The good guys are beset on all sides by an evil army. They are protected by the walls of stout stone made by their ancestors years and years ago. They stand shoulder to shoulder with their allies, ready to fend off the foes. And forget that, let's lead the siege. This is what I'm saying by like bucking cliche. I love that people tend to give players the chance to hold a castle, right? It does feel very heroic, right? You surround the enemy with the army of darkness. Screw that. I want to lead the siege. Imagine for a moment your players have managed to create a labyrinthine amount of agreements and diplomatic ties that have given them a small army, and they are the ones who are forced to attack and destroy a fortification. This is not something I see a lot of people doing, and I think it is actually infinitely more interesting than being the ones who hold the castle down. Why? First things first, there's really not much of a goal beyond defend the castle at that point, right? That is the major difficulty. When you are the one behind the walls, you only have one goal, and that is to survive. This can lend protecting a castle or being the defender in a siege feeling a little bit boring and a little bit stale. However, leading a siege, I think, is a far more infinitely interesting idea, and we're going to talk about why in just a second. So, First things first, it gives the players time to plan, right? The players should have some knowledge of what they are going up against because, again, it's a castle. It's not like it's invisible. The players can see it. The players can send scouts around. They can use some forms of magic, but keep in mind that there's probably counter magic that's going to be deployed against them. But again, players can and should do a lot to try to gain some understanding of the defenses against which they are arrayed. This is something that is really interesting because players who like gathering information, or more stealthily inclined PCs, can in fact use their talents and abilities to garner information. This is the best part about this, right? Because the players don't have, or the players have one goal, right? Just like defending the castle, the players have one goal, except they have a bajillion different ways that they are going to try to take the castle. And this is where you, as the game master, should play around with the idea of imperfect information. Rumors about a castle and what defenses it includes should abound. And good players, smart players, should spend a lot of their time trying to decipher between what is fact and what is fiction before they commit their forces to an attack. Why would you want to do this? This is another thing I think you should do. Shout out to Elven Tower Adventures. This is an image from one of their products, but I want to make sure that we give them some good credit. But again, having the players, again, infiltrate the castle to make sketches could be super huge, right? This is what I'm talking about, where I think that laying siege to a castle is infinitely more interesting than attacking or than defending the castle. Because, just like we talked about, there are so many different ways you can go about doing it. This sketch could be attained by a player disguising themselves as a peasant or a member of the defending force and sneaking back in after a failed raid by the defenders. That's one way they could get this. The player could, potentially, if they have access to some sort of magical animal, like a familiar if we're playing Dungeons & Dragons, or access to like a ghostly ability, like, for example, Blades in the Dark, if you're a Whisper, they could potentially use that ally to gain access to the castle this way, and then have that ally come back, see through their eyes, and then sketch out this plan. They could also get this map by bribing a prisoner or threatening a prisoner from the defending army. Now again, maybe that person doesn't have a total understanding of what's in the castle, and so this sketch, while useful, might be imperfect or flawed. Then of course you also have the issue of, okay, what if I tortured this out of somebody? Then are they going to truly give me the most reliable information, or is this sketch completely wrong? Again, when you're attacking the castle, there are so many different ways that you can approach it. You can find ways to attack from the air. You can find ways to attack from underneath through tunnels. This is a real strategy that you might do. You can even find ways to attack using conventional methods. Give your players who are martially inclined a chance to lead the forces. But again, resources like this are why I love besieging a castle rather than defending a castle. Now, I talked about imperfect information before. And I really want you to talk about that because this was a real thing, right? Unless you lived in a castle or defended said castle or built said castle, castles were not things that a lot of people knew very well in medieval times or even into the late Renaissance. And in fact, that was part of the reason that castles were so useful. These were designed to be honeycombs of death and torment for the attacking players or attacking army. It was actually a real thing. I don't know why I'm talking about it like it's a game. But yeah, the idea is that they wanted this to be as confusing and dangerous as possible, which is exactly why we're talking about it like this. You want rumors about a castle. The milkmaid's cousin knows that there is a secret key to the dungeon. The disgraced leather worker who was forced out of town talks about how there are flaws in the foundations of the walls on the west side of the building, right? These rumors abound, and it's really important because part of a castle's strength, or any fortification strength, is its mystery. So let's talk about how that works. A couple different things that I think you should use in your games, regardless of the system that you do, are some of these historical things. So this is an actual picture from an actual castle in Scotland. I am blanking on the name of it, but something you may have noticed if you are a keen-eyed observer is that the stairs in this castle are all a different height. They are not uniform. Or, in some cases, not for this particular tower, in some cases, all of them were uniform except for certain steps. These were referred to as murder steps or false steps. in which case a person trying to run up this tower to continue the attack would trip or would be similarly inconvenienced while they were in the middle of a battle. This is a huge problem. Also, consider for a moment the way that these staircases are arranged. The majority of people in the world, whether you like it or not, are right-handed. This means that you would, theoretically, carry a sword or other weapon in your right hand. If you are coming up the tower, your right hand runs right up against this banister, which means you are at a disadvantage, as opposed to somebody defending the tower, which comes down and has the advantage because their right hand has all of this free space. Also, consider that somebody can use this little banister area, and I forget the central column area, to protect half of their body, whereas this space offers zero freaking cover to people going up. So if you're going up a staircase, you should be at potentially some sort of disadvantage, or at the very least have a chance to trip and fall. This is an interesting defense mechanism that was employed in pretty much every medieval castle. It's important to make note of because some of your towers could be like that. And if the players know that, that's useful. These are murder holes. Yes, that is the actual name for this. These are murder holes. The idea is that at different points in the castle, so for example, on one side would be one gate, on the other side would be another. What happens is, let's say that the enemy broke through one gate, they would seal the opposite side, and then boiling water, or rocks, or arrows, or venomous creatures, or in some cases, human excrement would literally be poured down these holes onto the attackers. If you were not careful, or if you were ill-prepared, entire groups of your soldiers could get pinned in an area like this, and then summarily unalived. These are really big problems because these are really, really good examples of obvious murder holes. But there are some crazy ones that look like they have either been built into murals or mosaics, or in some cases frescoes, so look like they're part of the artwork, and people just wouldn't know what those are. Again, this means that the players who have infinite possibility and infinite ways to approach a siege are also confronted with infinite danger when they are facing a siege. And with that, folks, I think I'm going to leave it there. I think these are two great set pieces that you, as a game master, should employ in your games. Like I said, I know the idea of the rickety bridge is a little cliche, but I think the way that we implemented it makes it a little more interesting. And again, for the love of all that's good and holy, even if you're running a good game in whatever system you're deciding to run, whether it's Vaesen or Call of Cthulhu or Flayo or Shadow of the Demon Lord or Dungeons & Dragons, even if you're running a good game, give your players the chance to lay siege to something and give them opportunities to do something really cool and problem solve to do whatever they can. Now, with that being said, I'm Kyle out for Desks and Dorks. Thank you all so much for your support. Like, share, comment, subscribe, buy our games in the description below. Or don't. I'm not a cop. What am I telling you? But in any case, you all are awesome. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.